Hello, I'm Sean Brown, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our inaugural McKinsey Live session on the economics of COVID-19, possible scenarios for the next normal. We hope you find today's session helpful as you lead your organizations through the crisis and that you remain safe during these uncertain times. Now I'd like to briefly introduce our presenters. Susan Lund is a partner based in Washington, D.C., and a leader of the McKinsey Global Institute. She's also a core member of McKinsey's COVID response team and has been working with clients on the global economic outlook. Bob Sternfels is a senior partner based in San Francisco and leads our client capabilities globally, which includes our industry practices, functional areas, and innovation priorities. He's also a member of our board of directors. As we begin, I want to just take a brief moment to acknowledge the breadth and depth of the global humanitarian challenge that COVID-19 represents for all of us. We're here today to discuss its potential impact and options for responses. If you'd like to access our latest thinking on the crisis, we encourage you to visit the COVID Response Center on McKinsey.com. Susan, it's now my pleasure to turn things over to you.
Welcome, everyone. The way we're thinking about the scenarios for impact is complex. We have two challenges before us today. One is how effectively we can contain this virus and keep it under wraps. And the second challenge is, can we minimize the damage to the economy as countries go into lockdowns and stay-at-home orders? So with those two frames in mind, we've created 9 different scenarios for potential outcomes. We think that different countries are going to end up in different places on this matrix. But the way it works is that on the vertical axis, you've got different scenarios for how quickly we can contain the virus. The top row would be the best case, where we can contain the virus in 6 to 8 weeks and then slowly reopen the economy sustainably. The middle row is a scenario in which we can contain the virus, but when we reopen, we see resurgences. And so we go into stop-start mode, and that's why you see a wavy line. The bottom row would be for countries that really don't have a public health response that can contain this virus. At the same time, we have unknowns about how well policy is going to be able to mitigate the economic damage as we all stay at home and work from home. And so here that's on the horizontal axis. So the rightmost column is the best case, and it would say that fiscal policy and monetary policy can offset the damage so that when the economy reopens, we get a strong response in consumer spending. The middle column would say we do have some long-term unemployment and bankruptcies, and so the recovery would be a bit slower. And the left column would be a case in which there would be a lot of damage to the economy. So a lot of people unemployed for a long time, business bankruptcies, defaults on mortgages and other forms of credit, and that could start to infect the banking system. So the way the matrix works is the upper right corner would be the best case outcome, and the lower left would be the worst case outcome. We then worked with a modeling firm, Oxford Economics, to actually put some GDP and consumer spending and investment numbers behind these scenarios for 48 countries around the world. We've also done executive surveys of leaders of businesses around the world to get their sense of what are they seeing on the ground. And what we found is we've now done this survey twice in April and May. We'll have a June result coming out in 2 weeks that you can look for on our website. But what we see is that the magnitude of this crisis is sinking in for business leaders. And they are, the largest number think that middle scenario, A1, where we're partially effective on the health front and partially effective on the economic front, is the most likely scenario. That's a scenario in which, for the United States and Europe, GDP would not return to the pre-crisis levels until the end of 2022 or the beginning of 2023. So that's a multi-year recovery. You can see that the boxes highlighted in blue to the left of this, scenarios B1 and B2, would be even longer recovery times. This does vary when you look around the world. You see that respondents in Asia tend to be more optimistic, choosing scenarios like A3 that you see shaded there and A4, whereas in the US and Europe, business leaders are really planning for a very prolonged downturn.
Susan, we had one question that came in, and the question that has come in is related to second waves, and how do these scenarios take into account any potential second or third waves? And do you see, or have there been any forecasts related to resurgence based on some of the protests going on across the U.S. right now?
Yeah, so in many of these scenarios, there may be a second wave of the virus. The question is, can we contain it rapidly? So even in the top row, we may see that as fall comes and winter comes, that there are more cases of the virus. But the question for all countries will be, do we have widespread testing available so that we identify who's sick quickly? And then those people quarantine themselves. And do we have contact tracing so that we can get in touch with everybody that somebody who tests positive has been in contact with so they can go get tested? And with measures like these, even if we get a second wave of the virus, we would be able to avoid the nationwide large-scale stay-at-home measures that we've been experiencing for the last few months. And this is what a country, for instance, South Korea, has been able to do. They have not had a national stay-at-home order because they have these capabilities in place. So that would be the hope. Now, if we're not able to do that, then we end up in the middle row of more of a stop-start recovery where different parts of the country or different countries in Europe may go back into stay-at-home measures for different periods of time, or the bottom row where we would get another massive uncontrolled flare.
We had one other follow-up question, and it's related to the executive sentiment that we see here on the page. And what is your view on the stock market recovery? It seems that shares have generally recovered faster than most companies have experienced consumer confidence.
Yeah, the stock market, first of all, I'll say I'm not an equity analyst. I can't tell you whether the market is overvalued or undervalued. But what I will say is that when you look underneath the market aggregates at how market cap is done for different types of companies, I think it makes a lot more sense. So you'll see that oil and gas companies, commercial air travel, banks have been hit very hard, while on the other side of the spectrum, you've got tech companies, for instance, WebEx, you've got pharmaceutical companies that are actually up over the course of this year. And I think what that reflects is really the varied impact that this crisis is having on different parts of the economy. It's unlike other recessions in that we do have sectors that are doing extremely well, while others are down, and we don't know when they're actually going to see consumer demand return to previous levels.
Thank you. Last question is related to who the executives were that this sentiment was from, and are they replying in regards to their own specific regions or more as global executives?
Great question. So it's over 2,000 executives from around the world. It's across industries, and this chart is showing you the global average. The responses by country tend to be different, and they are responding for their own country. So in Asia, China, Singapore, Korea, responses tend much more to be in scenarios A3 and A4, where you get a more rapid recovery. U.S. Tends to be more around the middle. Same with Europe. Latin America is even more pessimistic. So you can actually find all these survey results. We publish them on McKinsey.com, but it does vary quite significantly by region.
Thanks so much, Susan. Back to you.
Great. If we could move ahead to the next page. In any case, even in the top row, this is going to be the deepest downturn that any of us have experienced. You need to go back to the 1930s and the Great Depression to see the magnitude of decline in GDP that we're going to see in this quarter. So this chart shows you scenarios A3, which is on that top row of one of the best outcomes, And scenario A1, which is in the middle of that matrix, so pretty significant, but certainly not the worst outcomes in that matrix, and compared to all the recessions in the United States since World War II. And it would look very similar in Europe. So the magnitude of the decline that we are living through right now is quite tremendous, and what matters a lot is how quickly will we come out of it. Will it be a multi-year recovery like A1, or are we going to be able to contain the virus and get back to business investment and consumer spending faster? If we go to the next page, it won't be news to you that a lot of people have been thrown out of work. In the United States, we've seen that 40 million Americans, which is 22% of the workforce, has applied for unemployment insurance just since March 15th. In some states like Georgia, it's 45% of the workforce has now applied for unemployment. This chart shows you the weekly initial claims, and they're trending down, but they're still 10 times higher than they were during normal times before this virus. If we go ahead to the next page, you'll see that analysis we've done at the McKinsey Global Institute has looked at how many workers are vulnerable to either being furloughed temporarily, laid off permanently, or seeing reduced hours. And this is because of the nature of their working closely with customers, or they're in industries like manufacturing for cars that have seen a huge drop in consumer demand. And our estimates done very early on in this crisis were that up to 57 million jobs, or 36% of the U.S. workforce, would be vulnerable. One of the interesting and frightening things about this is that, not surprisingly on this chart, you'll see it's predominantly workers in accommodation, food service, and retail, but really there are workers in every part of the economy, including healthcare, which may surprise some people, that are vulnerable. And this speaks to the huge breadth of this economic calamity that we're living through.
Sorry, we got a couple more questions come in related to the unemployment statistics that you shared previously. Specifically, do you see any major inflection points, e.g., when some of these unemployment benefits expire, that there'll be another big kick up in terms of people returning to work? Anything you can share there?
Yeah, we may. I mean, the unemployment rate has skyrocketed, but what we don't know is how many people will be able to go back to their job when their establishment reopens, and how many of those are permanent layoffs. And we also don't know the impact on incentives. So at the end of July, when the additional unemployment benefits run out, we may see more people returning to work. It will also depend on one of the things Bob is going to talk about, which is to what extent can we develop new health protocols and ways of working that make people feel comfortable and confident that it's okay to go to work and it's okay to go out and get about our daily lives. So I think in the interest of time, if we can move very quickly to the next slide, then I'll turn it over to Bob. This just shows you a consumer sentiment survey. A lot of the recovery is going to depend on how confident are people in going out and spending, and how confident our business is going to be in undertaking new investments. What you see in this chart is we do this survey, this pulse survey, every few weeks in many countries around the world. And what you'll see is that the U.S. Consumers are more optimistic, certainly, than those in Europe and places like Brazil, less optimistic than those in India and China. But this could bode well for the recovery, although sentiment is changing. And as the magnitude of the crisis hits us, these numbers may change. So now if we move ahead, I'm going to hand it over to Bob, who's going to talk about shifting towards how we think about returning and reimagining the economy.
Thanks, Susan, and thanks everybody for joining. We're innovating with our formats here, and we do appreciate you joining us. As Susan noted, I'm going to talk about what we all can do about this as leaders, and I will frame my remarks in the context of business leaders. That's how we've thought about this. And I would start with a framework that you've seen we publish around this notion of the 5 R's. the idea of we've all gone through a journey of resolve. How do we build the fortitude to deal with some unprecedented changes in all of our lives? Resilience, how do we build the ability to respond given the wide range of signals that we've all seen? I think every institution and us and individuals personally are past both of those phases, and we're now into some form of return. And I think the main thesis that I wanted to hit is this notion that return and reimagine should actually happen simultaneously. We need to build resilience into the return phase. It's probably going to be longer than we think, and I'll unpack that as we go. And there are some opportunities to reimagine while we return. So if we go to the next slide and focus on why talk about resilience as part of the return phase. We did some work looking at the last downturn. And although, as Susan pointed out, the last downturn is different than this downturn, we do think that there are some interesting implications that can be learned. And we took a look at all companies from 2007 to 2020 and categorized them in three categories: resilient outperformers, and I'll define a bit more of what resilient outperformers did in a second, regular outperformers, and everyone else. And the interesting thing that emerged was there was a significant difference in terms of outperformance in this group of the resilient. And it led us to the question of, well, what did they do? And is there anything that we could learn from what they did as we go through this set of disruptions? And so if you go to the next slide, I'll try and unpack a bit of what companies did that were in this resilient outperformance category. And I'll break them into more defensive measures and then opportunities to play offense. On the defensive side, some of this should be near and dear to all of our hearts. Cash is king and liquidity matters more than ever as you go through a period of crisis. The resilient outperformers did manage liquidity better than everybody else. Interestingly, from an investment point of view, they did two things. One, they slowed more aggressively at the start to pause and reprioritize, but then critically, in the depths of the downturn, ramped recovery spending faster than peers. And I think there's an interesting idea there as we think about where we are of when then to restart investment. And this notion that winners did identify at least options around this and then figuring out how to invest that. So second thought. And a third one that I'll come back to because I think has particular implications for the here and now is companies that outperformed simplified their organizations. They sped things up. And I will argue later that an opportunity of what we've learned working in a remote environment provides a foundation, perhaps even better than 08-09, to rewire organizations for speed. Those were some of the defensive measures. If we go to the offensive measures, I might highlight a few. One was the notion that may seem commonplace right now, but this idea of accelerating digital channels and offers. In 2010, that was an unheard of concept. But if we think about things that are common to us today, like the Apple App Store launched in 2010, Netflix conversion to online, 2010, Walmart moving to walmart.com, 2010. These were all moves for resilient outperformers in this move to digital. And we know that in the B2B space today, there's been triple the activity on B2B online over the last 12 weeks than there was previously. Second notion, and I kind of put these two together, is a reallocation of capital. And you heard on the previous one of re-ramping capital spend, but it's also into adjacent fields. If we take Amazon, which is a great example, their move from continuing to fund retail, but also then really backing Andy Jassy with Amazon Web Services began around this period. The notion had started 4 years previously, but the capital spend started as a platform for a new business opportunity. Looking at multi-geographic growth and rebalancing around growth markets, if you look at the insurance industry and the pharma industry, there was a massive reallocation for the winners. And then this idea of leaning forward on M&A. So if we take some of those learnings and we go to the next slide and then say, what could this mean for us today? I think the first point is thinking about return as a muscle and a process rather than a specific plan. And the notion of this comes from some of the work that Susan was doing that, unfortunately, will be in a return phase of fits and starts for a while, likely a year, it could be longer. And what that means in enterprise is that we need to be constantly aware of four things and make adjustments. The signals that we'll get from consumers and suppliers and partners will constantly evolve. How do we stay on top of that at a micro level as behavior changes? And you saw the consumer sentiment work that Susan was doing. We all took cuts at segmenting our workforce that were thought unthinkable 12 weeks ago. Who needs to be on-site critical? Who can actually flex between remote and on-site? Who can work remotely? These weren't common terms 12 weeks ago, and there's been some great thinking on it, but they are estimates. And we'll learn from that, and as we learn what's working, how do we evolve that workforce segmentation? The regulatory environment is changing at a city, county, state, federal level in the US, at a country and regional level globally. As that evolves, how do we change our signals? And finally, we're all trying things. We're segmenting and redesigning our workplaces for safety. We're testing. We're experimenting with contact tracing. What are we learning? And so this notion of building a muscle here that will stay with us for a year or more, I think is one critical aspect on the return side of things. If you then go to the next slide and then think about how do I marry return with Reimagine, this is where perhaps we could get some excitement. I realize so far a lot of this may be have a dose of pessimism, but let's actually flip to some observations that might shape the next normal. And I'd start with the notion we know distance is back, not only of who can travel cross-border, cross-state, et cetera, but as those restrictions are loosened, how do we instill confidence in individuals to come back to work, to come back to retail, et cetera? The experience that individual enterprise creates can actually influence consumer behavior and drive the actual results that Susan showed as opposed to be reactive to it. And we think that there's a really interesting opportunity here to shape the return. Resilience and efficiency, there's been a lot of talk about I probably optimize my enterprise too far on the efficiency frontier as opposed to building in resilience. And rethinking the notion of risk-adjusted return, stress testing decisions in an enterprise is paramount now. And many institutions are starting to think like banks that historically weren't banks. And how do I actually think about this notion of a risk culture across many aspects of decision-making? Contact-free economy, I think we've all realized that going to the grocery store, flying on an airplane, staying in a hotel, traveling on public transport will be different going forward at an individual consumer journey level. Where I think the interesting business opportunity here is in the B2B workflows, the rise of telemedicine in healthcare, the leveraging of expertise in distributed field force. I was on with the CEO of a utility that has 200,000 workers in the field force. And he was talking about the wonderful opportunity to leverage core engineering expertise by now having them remote in a control room to help multiple field teams as opposed to being on site. And it was driven at first by safety, but there's a huge productivity unlock. So what's the productivity opportunity as we think about contact-free workflows? Government intervention will rise. Susan talked about a stimulus package that probably has never been seen since the Great Depression. I think the really interesting opportunity is what's going to be the public-private set of relationships by industry vertical, and how can industry work in collaboration with government to set a new set of regulatory guidelines. Stakeholders, not just shareholders, this is the notion of purpose. And I've heard many CEOs say, Bob, the decisions that I make now won't be remembered for the next quarter or two, but they'll be remembered for the length of my CEOship. And this notion of the actions that we take as enterprise, being remembered by suppliers, customers, employees, et cetera, I do think is incredibly important, and it's here to stay. Maybe two exciting opportunities. 21% of consumers in the US have switched brands or channels over the last 12 weeks as we've gone to different methods of go-to-market. That can present an incredibly frightening situation or an incredibly exciting opportunity in that, in many ways, the consumer is up for grabs. How does enterprise take advantage of that and redefine themselves to perhaps play across industry boundaries, launch new products, launch new channels to drive growth? And finally, on this notion of emerging stronger, and I'll come back to the idea of the rewiring for speed, I haven't met a leader yet that isn't incredibly proud about how their organization has pivoted to operate over the last 12 weeks in incredibly difficult circumstances. Everyone is playing a level up. When I then ask, as you begin the return, do you want to return to how it was 12 weeks ago? I get a no. And when you push under that, what you find that folks are most proud about is the idea that things are moving faster. We're more agile, we're quicker. And I wonder, is there an opportunity to rewire large enterprise for speed coming out of this downturn? So I'll close, Sean, maybe with the last slide, which then might be just 4 perhaps no regret moves as leaders of large enterprise. There is an opportunity to rebuild our operations, rethink that resiliency, efficiency frontier in terms of our supply chains, our supply partners, et cetera. There is an opportunity as consumers are up for grabs to rapidly recover revenue. And how can you be front foot around that to drive growth? I would make the case of rewiring for speed on the organization. I think this could be an incredible unlock and engine for growth. And then maybe finally, I think the idea that the future will be digital, to quote some of our colleagues. I think what we've seen is that today's existing technologies have finally come home in terms of driving incredible ROI across the enterprise and providing incredible experiences for consumer. So how do we rethink our technology investments to enable all this? Thank you.
Thank you. So we've got a number of questions. I'm going to try and squeeze 2 in. The first one is related to confidence, and specifically not so much consumer confidence, but confidence in the ability to not get sick and re-engage in the economy. So what if things reopen, but the public doesn't come? Restaurants, sporting events, air travel. What's McKinsey's point of view in terms of how that's going to play out?
Look, I think confidence and therefore sentiment, is an evolving notion. Would be my thought, Sean. I think that the emphasis for all of us as leaders as we try things will be a heightened emphasis on communication. What is working? When you visit a retail outlet in Hong Kong today, you get an incredible amount of data entering the store, temperature check, actually assurance on with a few leading retailers of everyone who has touched a product that you're about to look at. And so I do wonder that to instill confidence, will we have to provide a level of information that historically we haven't seen before? That might be the notion.
Thank you. The last question, and this is sort of a macro question. Bob, you alluded to a number of things that may change and become a new normal. What are some of the most positive trends, that long-term trends, that you and Susan are excited about in terms of how we come out of the crisis? So is it productivity? Is it work patterns? Is it the environmental impact? What are some of the things that you're most excited about how we could make something good of this?
I'll hit one, and maybe Susan, you could close with another. What I would hit is the landing of technology in all aspects of B2B workflows. We've done some work that showed that 80% of the value of technology over the last 15 years had occurred more in the B2C industries. We think the potential had always been B2B, but barriers around regulatory and behavioral change were slowing the adoption of those technologies. Many of you are in B2B industries. We've pushed through many of those barriers, and I would highlight the telemedicine example as one particular really exciting opportunity going forward.
Thanks, Bob. Susan?
So I would say that one of the things that I think is very positive is the broader thinking of companies about who are their stakeholders. And as Bob said, we may see a larger role of government in different forms and different levels in the economy, but I do see a real partnership. I've seen fierce competitors come together over this crisis to develop new products to launch. I've seen companies thinking in a different way about their workforce and taking into account things like we're working from home. Some of us have children around, and we're suddenly home educators, small businesses, workers, all in one. And I think this has been a big unlock for the role that companies can play in the recovery and how they think about the world more broadly.
Awesome. Susan, Bob, thanks so much for taking the time with all of us today. For everyone on the session, on behalf of McKinsey Live, thank you for joining us as well. We look forward to having you join us for our next McKinsey Live session and wish you all a wonderful day or evening. Take care, and Susan and Bob, thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.